Kitchens. Tranel. Here. Crew. Here. Belskowski. Summerfield. Here. Rampton. Here. Kurtz. Here. Brooks. Here. Pope. Krasinski. Senator Coles. Jacques. Testin. Here. Miller. Here.
We have a quorum. As we have gone along in the hearings, we started in May, and this is our last week. After today, we'll head to Superior tomorrow. As we held our hearings, we invite neighboring representatives who are not on the task force, but we allow them to sit with us, ask questions. So I'd like to welcome Representative Emerson, Representative Petrak, Representative Magnifici, who have come down. I believe Senator Smith and Senator Schochner are on their way. So we have a full house today. To remind the public, if you'd like to speak during our public hearing portion, there's a table out there that you can sign up to register, and we'll call you. Also, all the presentations you see today will be online at our website, waterqualitywi.com, probably Monday, I would assume. So with that, we will get started. I would like to ask Chancellor Guilfoyle to come up and welcome us.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to UW Stout. My appreciation to the members of the task force for their efforts in addressing important issues on water quality. I also wish to thank members of the audience who have taken time out of their schedules to learn about and provide information about water quality in Wisconsin. Prior to coming to UW Stout, I lived a couple of decades in Bemidji, Minnesota, and both Menomonie and Bemidji are similar in several ways. They have a similar population, and they both have a lake right in the middle of town. However, the attitude and orientation to the lake is very different in the two communities. In Bemidji, people really face the lake. There was a state park with beach access. There were a number of public beaches on the lake, numerous boat launches, a fishing pier, and other amenities. The lake was busy all summer long, and it was a tourist attraction. In Menomonie, there have been times in the summer when my wife and I had been canoeing on Lake Menomonie, and we were the only boat on the lake. Living in Menomonie, I sometimes have the impression that Lake Menomonie is something viewed as being hidden rather than celebrated. So clearly our community has been affected by degraded water quality. I would like to point out that UW Stout is a partner in efforts to address water quality issues in our region. Faculty have received 2 National Science Foundation grants that are interdisciplinary and focused on helping undergraduates conduct research with faculty in the sciences, economics, social science, environmental science, and other areas, keying in on water quality in our area. The Center for Limnological Research and Rehabilitation is an extension-like research center that focuses on eutrophication and phosphorus to mitigate cyanobacterial blooms. The center works on projects on a contract basis and is part of UW Stout's Discovery Center. UW Stout is also planning to participate in the Freshwater Collaborative for Wisconsin. This is a new UW system initiative related to water quality in the state. And finally, we also have a curriculum in environmental science, applied science, and applied social science that involves watershed management, aquatic biology, and other areas related to addressing pollution of freshwater lakes. We look forward to continuing to be a partner in efforts to improve water quality in Wisconsin. So again, thank all of you for your participation in this event. I'm hopeful that our lakes, streams, wetlands, and groundwater will benefit from your efforts. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you for hosting us. First up, testifying will be Wisconsin Dairy Alliance, Cindy Lakener, President.
Inviting us here. Thank you to the group that was out with us today at CAFO Dairy Farm. I think we all learned a lot this morning, including myself, and I've been on quite a few large farms. Wisconsin Dairy Alliance represents modern regulated dairy farms in Wisconsin and works diligently to preserve Wisconsin's heritage as the dairy state. Our nonprofit organization advocates for the truth by contesting unnecessary regulations that do not protect natural resources. The Wisconsin Dairy Alliance believes in parity for all dischargers and works to operate under the uniform zero discharge standard that's applied to all Wisconsin Dairy Alliance members. We represent CAFO, for those of you that are listening. Many of today's large farms in Wisconsin have been designed and built to achieve the lowest carbon footprint ever achieved in animal agriculture. agriculture. Producing a gallon of milk uses 90% less land and 65% less water, with a 63% smaller carbon footprint than in 1944. Thanks to improvements made by dairy farmers in cow comfort, health, nutrition, and breeding, according to the Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy. Yet large livestock's impact to local water supplies is consistently called into question, with article after article claiming well-designed, well-built, and well-managed large farms as the culprit. It's a common enough PR ploy, ignoring laws for some businesses who pollute by singling out larger corporate businesses as a scapegoat, and then feeling good that the pollution problem was solved. The push to add tougher regulations on already heavily regulated farmers ultimately does nothing to reduce pollution that has been the focus for some 3 years. Let's take a look at some statistics from the Wisconsin Department of Resources and the Wisconsin Groundwater Coordinating Council report to the legislature in 2019. This is a map of the CAFOs in Wisconsin from the DNR and their locations. The second map is an estimated percentage of private wells over nitrate standard by county with land cover from the Wisconsin Groundwater Coordinating Council report to the legislature in 2019. You would think the counties with the highest percentage of wells over the nitrate standards would have the most CAFOs in them, right? Let's take a look. This is a list of the top 10 counties that have CAFOs in them. The top 10. In order. Note all the percentage of wells exceeding the nitrate level are under 7.1% except for Dane County at 18.2. All of these counties have 10 plus CAFOs and some over 20. That's a lot of CAFOs for some small counties. Let me fix that. As close as possible. Okay. Oops. Now let's take a look at the top 20 counties who have the highest percentage of wells over 10 parts per million. There are only 4 counties, including Dane, that have more than 5 CAFOs, and all of these counties have over 10.4% of their wells above the nitrate level. Take a look at Iowa County, halfway down, 3/4 of the way down, 12.5% over the nitrate level for their wells, 0 CAFOs. Our CAFOs the problem. Pollution comes from all sources, including unregulated small farms, crop farmers that use chemical fertilizers, homeowners that haul polluting nitrates home every spring in the form of lawn fertilizer, golf courses, rural residents with substandard septic systems, and outdated wells that are not compliant with today's standards. Empathy for small farmers is understandably strong. In Wisconsin, for instance, environmentalists and media ignore the 1 million cows raised on unregulated farms by blaming the 300,000 cows that live on already regulated dairies for virtually all of the groundwater ills in Wisconsin. Why? Cost and enforcement. Small farms are struggling. Asking for more to be done will cost them something that they cannot afford. While the intention may be there, enforcement only occurs when the farmer receives money from the state's taxpayers, referred to as cost sharing. Ignorance over the impacts of crops and vegetable farming is palatable. You can't see or smell chemical fertilizer, so therefore it must not be a risk. The homeowner with a failing septic system or substandard well and over-applied lawn chemicals also bears some blame. Meanwhile, government municipalities who do controlled releases in tens of millions of gallons of human sewage annually into the state's waterways are met with overwhelming silence. CAFOs have 0 discharge permits at the production site, and they are all required to have nutrient management plans which contain strict guidelines on spreading. They are regulated, fined, and they can be referred to the Department of Justice for prosecution if they are out of compliance. They are the only dairies treated in this manner. Wisconsin must pursue an all-encompassing approach to environmental management. To solve this, there needs to be a path to compliance developed for all sources. not just some. This will not happen overnight, nor will it come without cost to all involved, including taxpayers. We believe it is time to bring everyone to the table to have a scientific discussion. The Wisconsin Dairy Alliance believes all dischargers want to be part of the solution. However, we need to trust and collaborate and require significant solutions. We will need to figure out things such as cost sharing. How do we pay for this? Well testing and compliance. Do we require it? Septic system testing and compliance. Who gets to pay for that? The cost of effective studies that are not just part of the blame game, but move us forward, giving viable solutions and outcomes. We need to face the municipal overflows and fix them, not just renew the permit for another 5 years at the same level. Innovation will be a key requirement, expanding our horizons, looking for potential new sources to solve our problems. We need to incent those that bring actionable results beyond regulations, beyond our habits of today. We will need to meet today's needs without compromising the ability for future generations to meet their own needs through a healthy environment, economic profitability, and social and economic equity. The Wisconsin Dairy Alliance is requesting the Water Quality Task Force to take a leadership role in forming the future for water in Wisconsin. We ask you to think long range. We ask you to provide a goal for Wisconsin's water, not just add regulations. Point us in the direction. We can do the work to get there. The Wisconsin Dairy Alliance firmly stands by the belief that we all have to, for potential dischargers, be on a path to zero discharge.
Good afternoon, committee members. My name is Brian Lupinka. I own B&D Dairy in Pound, Wisconsin. I am one of the largest dairy producers in Wisconsin. I have been a CAFO for approximately 20 years. I am on my third or fourth permit cycle. The permit process for CAFOs has sort of evolved as the years went by, and it's become quite a complex animal. When a rule was passed, NR 243, that raised the bar to the highest level that made us all have the zero discharge standard. That rule alone cost me $125,000 a month in potential loss or potential increased expenses. I have grown accustomed to the rulemaking process that we have in place, and I am okay with where I am. But I have a concern. My concern is, in my county, there's 3 or 4 of us that carry the same regulatory burden. When I watch producers with 400 cows spread next to the waterways, and my setbacks are different, and I call the local land and water folks to ask the question, what gives, because manure tankers and the watershed don't differentiate whose manure is from a big farm or a small farm. The watershed only measures nutrients. Their exact response 2 days later was, they have a different spread plan than you did. Well, I brought my spread plan with me, and I wish I could share it with everyone. This is every field that I farm. On each one of them is a map. We put it together early in the year. We get it approved with the guidelines of the agency, which I have not a problem with the guidelines. Then we go out and spread, and if there's a complaint, people call in, and things are measured right to the foot where my setbacks are. My neighbor does not need to meet that requirement. That bothers me considerably. But there's one thing that bothers me worse about this whole discussion, and it's an incredible task you have ahead of you. We did the math on 330,000 cows in Wisconsin that are under CAFO permits. Out of about 1.2 million, we think we're about 27% of the cows are covered with CAFO permits. Well, we kind of know my nutrient plan, about 1.5 acres per cow, will satisfy the land spreading requirements so we can uptake the nutrients we've applied and do that sustainably. Well, if you do the math on the CAFO farms, we're about 4% of Wisconsin's ag land. So when you talk about CAFO permits, you're talking about regulating 4% of the ag land in Wisconsin, and the other 96% are managed by good people, but there's nobody watching them to the extent they're watching me. There's no Justice Department ready to hang me if I have a runoff event or the agency to bring forth this whole process. That bothers me worse than anything. And if there's one thing I could ask you folks to think about, before you make any more regulations for the CAFOs, why don't we do something that wouldn't cost the taxpayers $5 and by spring have everybody working on the same plan as I have? If it was put together for me, it was put together for the watershed and the river system in Lake Michigan and all our wonderful lakes we have. If it was demanded of me and it has importance, why is it not demanded of the other 96% of the acres in Wisconsin? To me, that's just crazy. But it's for discussion on another date.
And just to highlight, some of the farm conservation ag strategies that are getting used today. And we know that you've heard from farmers throughout the course of this process. Many of them are friends. Farmers are doing great things. You saw it today on your tour. You've seen it if you've gone to other farms. We're doing more nutrient management plans than ever before. That's a requirement and a cost of doing business to all CAFOs today. We're utilizing more no-till, more minimum tillage, more conservation tillage, more crop rotation, cover crops, split nitrogen applications, utilize buffers, wetlands, bioreactors, plant genetics, low-density manure injections. The list could go on and on and on. And this is an ever-changing list. But it highlights one of the greatest things about agriculture today is our continual improvements over time. Oftentimes with people like Brian and Dave, who you met today, leading the way. The CAFO story is rarely told. This is one of my favorite quotes. A reliable way to make people believe in falsehoods is frequent repetition, because familiarity is not easily distinguished from the truth. You will hear a lot of people talking about CAFOs and telling this story. But I challenge anyone to go on a farm tour, to spend time with a CAFO. There's a lot of misinformation about agriculture, particularly about CAFOs today, some of which you will continue to hear throughout your hearings. But the real story of a CAFO lies in the farmer. There is no one way, one size fits all way to farm. And you saw that today on your tour. And when we talk about the talk versus the truth, environmental stewardship, regardless of farm size, is on the forefront of every farmer's minds. The misrepresentation of data is rampant. I caution everyone that we should be careful how much statistical significance we give to studies that are correlation studies, not cause and effect studies. And there's much of that in the media today. Regulations. The regulatory framework on CAFOs, we talk all the time how we should make a list, because most people don't understand it, because it takes time to sit and talk to a farmer and ask the questions that you have. When we look at CAFO regulations, we talk all the time about the zero discharge standard at the farm site. That's just a small piece of it. There's no winter spreading. There's annual on-farm water samples. If you have over 25 employees, you have a water program that costs real money, thousands and thousands of dollars each and every year. We have lagoon engineering. That's unbelievable and always improving. Daily manure calendars that farmers have to fill out, have to submit. We have mandatory nutrient management plans. And so the regulatory framework is often misunderstood, but CAFOs are leading the way. Manure as a resource. Manure is an important resource for farmers as fertilizer. And we heard from the farmer today on the tour. He doesn't even have enough manure to satisfy all the nutrient requirements of his land. But if we're going to look at water quality, we do need to look at all dischargers. And we have to have some hard discussions. I always compare the municipality controlled releases to farmers. Because if we really put a number on those are staggering. That's a staggering amount of waste that goes into the waterway as a controlled release that's allowed from many of our municipalities. Last June, Milwaukee, 363 million gallons of untreated sewage was legitimately permitted to be dumped. Let's convert that back. Let's use an average manure tanker. That'd be over 60,000 tanker loads of manure. If that had happened, if a farmer had done that, if a CAFO had done that, not only would you be in jail, we'd be all over Good Morning America. And not in a good way. It's not just large cities, this is allowed everywhere. My old hometown of Wausau, last June, 3.7 million gallons. That's over 600 tankers of manure. So what we're looking for is an entire watershed approach. That agriculture is part of the solution, and that the true story of CAFOs is really told. The CAFO contribution in our state, you already heard that it's 300,000 of our 1.3 million cows, it's 40% of our milk. There are unintended consequences to this anti-CAFO rhetoric if you choose to listen to it. I can give you a great example. Wisconsin Cheesemakers Association recently had their annual meeting. Their entire discussion was about the state of South Dakota. That should be alarming to all of us in the room. South Dakota they're having the fastest growth in not only number of dairies, but size of dairies. So our cheesemakers are looking at other states. How are we going to compete? How are we going to be able to compete with them? When we already have animals going out of the state, already have a lot of young stock going out of the state, and dry cows going out of the state because of the regulatory framework that nearly pushes them that way. So there are unintended consequences of more regulations placed on the regulated. Planning solutions, we're asking you to continue your support of the farmer-led conservation groups. I know that you've heard from them in the other events that you've had. They're very successful. Farmers learning from farmers. You heard it today on the tour. You'll hear it from any farmer that you take the time to talk to. Continued support of the UW Discovery Farms. We have 18 years of research showing advancements in agriculture and improvements that we're making. And cost sharing. A watershed approach to water quality to bring other industries and dischargers up to CAFO standards. Because CAFOs can help lead the way. The world has changed for your example, not for your opinion. I always encourage everyone to connect with farmers. If you have questions about agriculture, if you have questions about CAFOs, take the time with the CAFO owner, take the time with the farmer, because at the end of the day, farmers are leading the way, and they hold more of the answers and the solutions that we're looking for. Thank you.
Representative Shankman.
This is very powerful. Okay. Yeah, maybe we should. Okay, so thank you so much for being here. There was a lot to unpack. I want to start, you started out by saying that there are unnecessary regulations. So I'd like to ask you for at least a few examples of regulations you view as unnecessary.
If I could answer that in a quick discussion, I think the whole concept of zero discharge has to be rethought. And there's a mentality in the regulatory community that all nutrients need to be contained. We're containing all this water, it's thinly diluted water, and then we turn around, we increase huge volumes in the lagoons of really low nutrient water, and the more water you add at the time of application, the more complicated and risky it gets to do that. So my first thought would be to rethink that how much water we're collecting and the zero discharge standard. The second discussion that I would have is really hard to stomach. You cannot make one set of rules for all these big farms in Wisconsin. They're all unique. They all have different watersheds. They have different land, kinds of land. You need to kind of customize the rules for the farm. And for instance, we have a rule, if we're above 2 feet, we cannot spread, if we're within 2 feet of surface water, we cannot apply manure. Well, last week I'm out in the middle of a field, it was flagged in my book, so I take my trusty postal digger, I could hardly dig down, the ground is so hard and dry, and there was no water, we're safe to go. But I also have fields that, because of the soil type, they don't want us to apply manure in summer. Well, you can't keep squeezing these windows down and want it all. We've got to kind of think that through and bring some broad scope to the horizon a little bit on some of that discussion.
Okay, so to follow up with that, with both of these regulations, do you think that they protect water quality? And do you think if we were to repeal them, that they would protect water quality?
Absolutely. The one with the water, we're collecting too much water on the farms. It should be allowed to carefully, some of it can be put on filter areas, MTAs, harvest the grass back off, pull the nutrients. With soil testing, there will be no surprises. You can apply nutrient soil testing, you know if it's working or not working. So water quality would improve if we could try and find ways to get less water in the whole mechanism of hauling.
When you talked about getting everyone onto the same page as the regulations that you have to follow, were you referring to your required nutrient management plan? Were you referring to other things? Do you want to list the different regulations you were thinking of when you said that?
Well, I think I'm going back to my spread plan, and mine is a little different than other people's. I have different setbacks, and I think when I witness certain individuals applying manure closer to waterway, I know that water, they're getting close to the water table, and I think if they had my plan, they would be at less risk. The other discussion that I have as far as water quality are some of the crop farms. And remember, I raise 8,000 acres of crops also, but I have my own fertilizer farm. But the crop farms have really nobody policing them, so they can put on as much as they want at planting. One day, I believe last year, we got 5.5 inches of rain during planting. We were doing the math, how much N got away on these guys that put all their N on at one time, the big crop farmers. I think that needs to be brought into the discussion.
I appreciate you mentioning that, because we've actually brought the N rate up at every single hearing thus far, and the need to localize and regionalize nutrient management plans for the soil type, doing more soil testing, as you mentioned, making sure there's not over-application, and understanding that the N rate could potentially be slightly suboptimal and still contain almost the exact yield that you'd get otherwise, right? So I appreciate that you mentioned that. I also, going to some of the other things that were said, just taking notes, PR ploy and scapegoat. So I'd like to hear a little more from you about what you mean by that. Just Googling a couple things, I mean, I think we've all seen instances of like manure lagoon breaches where there's equipment failure, or maybe there's a lot of rain, so there's so much rain, there's some runoff. I guess I would like to hear an example from you about a PR ploy or scapegoat on this issue.
So last year, there was a spill in Oneida County, a massive spill in Oneida County of 300,000 gallons. In Milwaukee, there was a 93 million gallon spill. There was maybe a half a newspaper article about it. Yet those spills that the CAFOs have, excuse me, are constantly repeated over and over and over again. We talk about karst, which karst is something that is a very special soil. The Silurian dolomite is a special soil. But when we talk about karst, we talk to people, some people in that area who are complaining about their water. And then they tell us that they have a basement in their house. How did they get the basement? Well, we just dynamited. We just dynamited to get our basement. Wow. I can't imagine a CAFO dynamiting to get anything, or being allowed to. CAFOs have become a scapegoat. The hearings that I've been at this year, everyone talks about the CAFOs, the manure, the smell. Yes, poop smells. Commercial fertilizer doesn't. We get it. But we need it. We need it for our land, and we need to find an equitable way to dispose of it.
Can I ask a question based on your example real quick? So you mentioned municipal wastewater. Do you think that CAFO should be regulated in the same way where they pay by the volume of their pollution like our municipalities?
I think one of the best things that's been done is the, you're going to tell me now, the credits, bill for the credits. New tree trading, thank you. I think that's going to help a lot. There's only so much that you can get out for the pollution, but I think we should be conscious of what we're doing. We should be looking at what we're doing. We should be frank about what we're doing. We shouldn't say that this person can go ahead and do that. And I know Milwaukee's doing a lot of stuff. They're putting in a lot of green spaces. They're working at having less in the watershed. But we all have to do it.
Well, and to finish on that too, I think it leads to our discussion of, is the goal really to improve water quality? Because if it is, what are the things in the watershed that affect water the most? And is it the things that make the media coverage the most? Or is it the real things that make the water quality the worst? So that's a real challenge, because no one wants to talk about what are we going to do to prepare municipalities for weather? And what are we going to do with the lead pipes? I mean, all of that takes real money, and you only eat an elephant one bite at a time. And CAFOs tend to be blamed the most across most media platforms.
Thank you for explaining your comments a little bit further. If I could just comment real quick, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. I think at the end of the day, what we're looking for is an honest dialogue between all partners and stakeholders, and we don't want anyone to come in feeling, using what I would call rhetoric to using words like PR ploy and scapegoat, when I think we all have a right to be concerned about every issue that you outline, not just CAFOs. But I do want to point out, for 4% of egg land, it's 25% of Wisconsin's cows. And so when we're talking about tens of millions of gallons of liquid manure in one space where there's one valve that breaks, or a massive storm, or we all know it's just one accident away, right? That's why there's concern, and that's why CAFOs are regulated. What I appreciate, sir, from your comments are that you actually think, it sounds like, more people should be living up to the standards that CAFOs are at, and hey, I can agree with that too. Let's get there. Let's look at the end rate. Let's look at how we manage other farms. And I appreciate those comments, but I do think it's important for when people come to the table to be, you're saying everyone's blaming us, but you're also casting some blame too. And I think it's important to be honest about, the realities here, and that, in the past few years, CAFOs have about 25% are still operating without permits right now, right? We have such a backlog. And so there's a lot of work that we have to do to get to that regulation and enforcement that it already should be happening, but I appreciate what you had to say today. So looking forward to continuing chatting.
Just can I say one more thing about the spills? And I don't want anyone to think that anyone in agriculture thinks that agriculture has no role to play in any of this. And when you look at manure spills, particularly reports from the DNR, it's less than half come from CAFOs, but CAFOs are the ones that you read about in the paper. Volume-wise, absolutely, but at the end of the day, you also have to remember CAFOs have a mandatory reporting requirement. So a spill doesn't necessarily mean that it makes it to the waterway. It could be something that was in the middle of a field, but how many times are you preached to about this at all of your meetings to call the 800 number, even if it is a 5-gallon bucket of manure that is not where it should be, it needs to be called in. And the relationship between the DNR and farmers has improved over time. Farmers do it. But just because you hear the words, because words shape perception, so just because you hear the words, oh, there was a manure spill, it doesn't say anything about the containment. Was it contained? Did it reach a waterway? Those are the important questions. Those are the questions to get answered by the DNR, because you will be surprised.
Representative Crandall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you talk a little bit, I appreciate your perspective being here as a farmer, especially when you're probably getting ready to chop corn silage. You mentioned several times that you have to follow a different set of rules than all the other farmers. Could you talk a little bit more about why your farmers be able to follow those rules and what it would do to the cost of production for all those little guys if they had to do the same thing that you did?
Well, that's a really good discussion. So why I have to follow them is an easy answer: by law. And as far as the spills, we have built so many safeguards into the manure storage. It's pretty hard on my farm, barring an earthquake, to have a major spill from the lagoon. Now, whether a tanker get tipped over on the road, that's another discussion. As far as the producers and cost, my cost came into play pretty much by super well engineered facilities. One of my pits, the last one, I believe $200,000 was the engineering bill alone that I had to pay for it. Well-built structure, guaranteed. But what I think the message here is a little bit is, I have the most adverse side of the costs were given to me. The highest cost for regulation I have. The other end of the spectrum has the lowest cost or no cost. And some of these farmers, I think if you would emphasize everyone having the same spread plan, they might actually enjoy a little more profit, because I don't think they're thinking through their nutrient loads as good as I'm forced to think through them. So that part of the equation, I don't think it would cost those folks as much cost as it cost me to get here, just because of my volume that I have to deal with.
Do you feel that sometimes the environmental regulation and scrutiny that the public wants to put you under is in contrast to maybe how they would all like to have small farms everywhere?
That's a really good question. So you have, hey, what makes a good story? It doesn't make a good story about me with this great big farm. What people love are red barns in Wisconsin. But I think what kind of happens is, I don't really know how to answer your question, but for a small farm, when he has a story, it's either a feel-good story or no story. When I have a story, it's like, it's a catastrophe. And that's the two differences.
Anyone else? Thank you, and thank you for the tour this morning. It was very informative. Next up is Wisconsin Dairy.
Yes, it does. Good afternoon. My name is John Holyvood. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the Wisconsin Dairy Business Association. The committee clerk has shared some information about our association. We represent dairy farms of all sizes across Wisconsin, including a diagram or a chart showing our different membership sizes. So while we do have about a quarter of our membership is CAFOs, we also have a lot of members who aren't CAFOs, those who are maybe nearing CAFO size, and also some that have very small farms. I am really honored to be here today on what I think is Dairy Day for your committee. I see that we're second to last, but we don't mind bringing up the rear. And it's also a pleasure to be here at UW Stout. I have a nephew who goes here, so I got to feed him, which is important for college students. And I'll probably stop for some Brew Devils after this. So this was about the best location I could hope for. I started talking about how I view this as a partnership, sort of going off of some of Vice Chair Shanklin's comments earlier, that really we do have to kind of all be in this together. That it's not going to be solved by just dairy farmers or livestock agriculture or agriculture overall, but industry needs to be involved, or municipalities, just the rank and file public, and of course we need the state's help as well. Because we're nearing the end of your whirlwind tour this summer, you've already heard a lot of great ideas about what could be potential solutions. I'm going to share a few others. Some of those might be redundant, and I apologize for that. Some might be new, or maybe a new perspective on one of those ideas that you've already heard. But while I do think we're all in it together, I do want to talk a little bit about how the legislature can help. And this is just an outline of some of the areas that we're going to go through today during my presentation. Starting with how you can support farmer-led conservation groups. I know you've heard from many of these groups, DBA along with Farm Bureau and the Pork Association, Cattlemen's Association. We actually pushed for the creation of this program a few budget cycles ago within Secretary Bransell and then Governor Walker. The idea behind it was that we could fund farmer-led groups where farmers could learn from each other about best management practices. They could test out things and not be afraid to fail, right? They could try new cover crops in a certain area and see which one grows better. Maybe they could have test plots to see which one grows better and at what rate and under what weather conditions. We know these groups are doing good work. You've heard from many of them already. State funding was recently increased in this most recent budget to $750,000 per year. And I think it's a small investment overall when we look at our total budget, but it's paying big dividends. We have these groups springing up all over the state. DBA is involved in trying to make these groups as successful as possible. We actually help to provide sort of backroom office support to a handful of groups. One in Dane County, one here in northwestern Wisconsin, one in northeastern Wisconsin, and also one in southwestern Wisconsin. And we've just hired our newest employee who will be focusing solely on helping to provide grant writing support and other, again, sort of backroom office support to these types of groups. These guys are great at trying new practices. They've got agronomists who are working with them. But when it comes to calling the caterer to make sure you have a successful field day, that maybe isn't their strong suit, but it's something that we can do. And so by doing that and by contributing that money in kind, we hope we can make as many of these groups as successful as possible. And we hope that, and urge you guys to continue to support this program going forward. It doesn't mean there should be absolute accountability. They do have to provide reports back to the DAT cap. But at the same time, we do think that this is something we're doing that is actually heading in the right direction. We would also ask you guys to start to rethink the non-point program. Now, some of this actually probably touches a little bit on what my colleagues from the Dairy Alliance had mentioned earlier. Are we getting the results that we want out of our non-point program? Now, the non-point program is more than a decade old now. We have two different administrative rules that oversee this. One's in our 151, which is the Department of Natural Resources, and the other one's at CAP 50. They work in tandem together. One's a performance standard, one's the technical standard. And our goal here is to try to improve water quality. But as you heard before, unless you are a CAFO, unless you're covered by livestock siting, unless you participate in certain tax programs, you don't have to comply with these rules unless you are provided cost share, and there's never enough cost share. Well, maybe we don't always do the best job of prioritizing our cost share either, giving those to the projects that are easy to fund or easy to understand versus really going after people who have problems and need to have them addressed on their farms. This program has also never been adequately funded. When it was originally created, they came out with what they thought would be a reasonable amount of money, and then we've, every single biennium, not funded at the level that they thought was necessary when they created it. And not surprisingly, that meant that the program has not been as successful as it probably could have been. So we have low adoption rates, and with those low adoption rates, once we have these standards, then the question is, how do we know that our standards are working? If you're in a county where only 15% of the arable land is actually complying with NR 151 and at CAP 50, how do you know whether NR 151 and at CAP 50 are effective in protecting the water quality in that county? The answer is you don't. And you won't until you have a much higher level of compliance with those rules. And so the question is, how do we get there? And it's probably something, from our perspective at least at DBA, that needs to be done incrementally, but at least something that we need to talk about as a state, about how we get more people involved and more people moving in the right direction. Maybe not all at the same standard at the same time, but at least heading in a positive direction. We want to encourage you guys to provide more resources for soil depth mapping and groundwater testing. We need good information to make good decisions. That's pretty basic. And we recently enacted new targeted performance standards under NR 151 that look at the eastern side of our state where we have a particular type of karst bedrock, silurian dolomite. In that area, those farmers have to do something above and beyond farmers elsewhere to comply with 151. And again, that's just those farmers that would have to comply with 151 anyway. CAFOs, livestock siting, those who might get farmland preservation, or those who have accepted cost share. But while a lot of those requirements underneath the new regs deal with soil depth or depth to bedrock, in many of those counties, of the 13 that are impacted by the new NR 151, we're working off of soil mapping that was done in 1978. So that's 2 years before I was born. So I usually think of things from a technological perspective that if they existed before I was born, maybe that's not the best technology. And I'd say that's probably true. So some counties have paid for mapping and have more up-to-date maps, but that's mostly because they've done it on their own, or with a little bit of help from certain state agencies. We need better information in all of those areas. We also need to have better groundwater testing data because we need to understand the scope of the challenges we face. And more importantly, we need that baseline to know how we're doing. I don't want to give any unrealistic expectations. You guys have already heard about the scope of the challenges we face with nitrates. Some of the age of the nitrates found in our groundwater is staggering. So we are not going to get there tomorrow, no matter what we do, or no matter what you guys come up with for your strategy going forward. But we need that baseline to know at least that we're making positive progress in the right direction. And if we're not, then we have to adjust course. I would echo the request to revise standards for wells and septic systems. Now this is a pretty extreme case, but I can say this was a photo taken by the Door County Sanitarian in Door County of a septic that's been removed from the ground. Now it's been mangled partially by the removal from the ground, but it was also mangled partially because it was already deteriorating in the ground. In a county that we know has very sensitive soils, in a county where we know has probably the most land mass covered by the new NR 151 standards, this is what we allow to be buried in the ground, often just a short distance from their wellhead. We need to know that we all have a role to play, and at least for rural homeowners, that means they need to do a better job with their septics and their wells. In some cases, this might mean we have statewide new requirements. For example, there's different casing requirements in Minnesota to try to prevent cross-contamination between different levels of an aquifer. Easy thing, something that we've never done here in this state, but would make a whole lot of sense, especially in those parts of the state that have more sensitive soils. And certainly in those areas that do, maybe it's the time to consider targeted performance standards or the equivalent thereof for wells and septics. So that if we're willing to look at farmers in a particular region because we know that region has water quality challenges, perhaps septics and wells in that region should also be held to a heightened standard. I also want to encourage us to embrace innovation and new technology. This is one of the best ways for us to make a big difference in a short period of time. I think sometimes new things come along and we get scared of them, or there's existing regulations that maybe make it hard for us to implement a new technology or idea, and I hope the legislature can become a champion for easing those roadblocks or allowing for experimentation and innovation where possible. One thing I'd encourage is the promotion of manure irrigation. Now, manure irrigation is a scary concept to a lot of people because they think of manure going through the air, and I understand that. But we did have a study committee convened by the state to study this idea, and they came up with different proposals about how we could do it safely. And why do I think it's important? Not just because it might save farmers money and hauling costs and things like that, but I think it's important for water quality. And the reason being that they can apply nutrients on growing crops when those crops are best able to uptake those nutrients. And it also broadens those narrow windows of application time that we heard Mr. LaPinka talk about earlier, where we normally have these spring and fall windows. And depending on our weather, they might be really narrow windows in the spring and fall where we have to apply all that manure that we've had over the winter time. Or conversely over the summer while our crops were growing. This gives us a much broader window to apply those nutrients. and hopefully at a reduced application rate that makes a lot more sense. But we have to be able to make that work. We have to allow people to actually use the technology. That might mean that we have to look at how local governments regulate this practice. It might mean trying to ease the ability for CAFOs to use this technology within their current permit structure. I also want to encourage you guys to become champions for vegetated treatment areas. Now, you guys didn't know that maybe a lot of you guys don't know what a vegetated treatment area is, let alone that you want to be a champion for it. But I'm here to talk about them because I think they're pretty important. A vegetated treatment area is an area of vegetation used to try to land treat nutrients, often coming off of a feed pad, but sometimes off of an animal lot as well. They've been used, again, mostly for feed pad runoff. So when the feed that you see in those concrete bunkers out in the landscape comes into contact with some water, which again, they try to cover it up, but maybe a little bit of water comes into contact with it. What happens is water runs off and it's picked up some of the nutrients from the feed, and now that water has a little bit of nutrients with it. How do we deal with that water? For many years, our Department of Natural Resources encouraged farmers to build these vegetative treatment areas. Areas where the water could run off at a slow rate onto. It would help the grass grow in that area. They'd harvest the grass in that area to pull off the nutrients. And that's how they encourage people to deal with it. Then there was a shift at the department where they wanted to go towards 100% collection. And I want to discourage that practice. Again, I think sometimes we get charged by saying we're discouraging that practice because it will be expensive for our farmers, and it will be. And that could be detrimental. And for people who want smaller farms, to Representative Tranel's question earlier, that has sort of the perverse effect. You make these people build a new storage to store this water, you think that's going to help you. That's really going to probably make them grow, because the only way they can afford that new storage is to borrow. And once they borrow, their lender will only tell them, we'll loan you that money, but only if you add a new barn so that your cash flow is better. So we force people into situations, unfortunately, sometimes where they grow in ways that maybe they wouldn't choose to do if they had another option. And as the point was made also by Mr. LaPinta, what we end up doing then is adding a lot of volume to our manure. We might commingle that water with manure, and again, it was mostly clean water that just come into contact with feed. Now we're adding it to manure, we're diluting that manure, so now our total volume that we have to spread in those same narrow windows is much increased. In addition, the liquid is far more diluted and more prone to leaching or runoff events. The possibility is heightened. So I want you to encourage and to be champions for VTAs, because I think VTAs are good for the environment. They're not only good for farmers, especially those who have already made that investment in them, but I think they will help to prevent the runoff and leaching events that we all want to see not happen. Now, related to that, we classify that water that comes into contact with feed as processed wastewater, the same as if it came out of an industrial facility. Why do we do that? Because that way we didn't have to write a new definition or a new section of administrative code. So we could just incorporate it by reference, the existing administrative code that deals with processed wastewater. But it really isn't a definition that fits this water or makes a lot of sense. It also, because of the setbacks involved with processed wastewater and the setbacks involved with manure, it actually encourages people to commingle those instead of keeping them separately. It's just not a workable function. We all benefit greatly by coming up with a new definition for what we want to call this, probably specific to what it actually is. I have here a picture of Dean Strauss from Sheboygan County standing next to a reverse osmosis system he has where he treats his manure. These treatment systems are pretty rare in Wisconsin. We just have a handful of them. One in Sheboygan County, one here in the northwestern part of the state. Basically, they're going to bring manure back mostly to what it is, which is water and clean water. But often it's hard for them to get discharge permits for a whole host of reasons. Anything that we can do as the state, and there's some things we can't fix because there's federal regulations involved here too, but there are things that we probably could do to ease the permitting of these systems. These are farmers who are spending millions of dollars on systems to basically bring their manure back to 70% clean water. We should be encouraging them if they want to make that investment, not discouraging them, not making it a nightmare to get a permit. This is really the best thing we could possibly be doing. And for those few people who could afford it or have the interest in doing it, I want to see those projects, wherever possible, green-lighted. We should be trying to work with them to make them a reality. And I think it's also important that we create a more viable future for digesters on dairies. Now, digesters don't solve all of our problems. Some people would say they reduce odor. There's some research to back that up. There's also people who probably argue with you against that. You might hear from some people who tell you after I'm done that that's not true. Another big thing that's important that they do, they also reduce pathogen load in manure, which is important when we're concerned about pathogens that might reach groundwater. So they're really useful. They also they work really well when you're trying to do one of these treatment systems. So if you're going to do treatment, it's not impossible to do it with untreated manure, but it's a lot easier with digested manure. So we need to come up with a way that digesters can be a decent option for farmers. And they used to be here in the state, but they're really not anymore. Now that doesn't mean we have to subsidize all of them, but I'm trying to step back and look at this as maybe what I'm calling the parfait approach, which is we have this possible revenue stream for farmers, and maybe they have some electrical buyback, and maybe some people are going to do it and transition it to natural gas. So that added up all together, they at least pencil out where they could be a slightly profitable enterprise, at least cover the cost of installing them. Not that it's a windfall for dairymen, but at the same time that you would encourage dairymen who already have them to keep them running. And for those who don't have them, they might consider installing them. Or working with them in a community setting, which we also know and we've seen is occurring in northeastern Wisconsin and is already happening in Dane County. And finally, I guess I've talked a lot about things I was hoping you guys could help with. I should talk about things that you're already doing. You helped to fund in this last budget a particular line item for research at 3 different UW campuses, including UW River Falls just down the road. And one of the main focuses of that research is going to be water quality, and water quality in tandem with the dairy community. So that's great, and thank you for that. Also, for those people who have worked on the water quality trading bill that we heard about earlier, SB 91, in fact, the author of that bill is on your committee, Senator Coles, and the co-author, Senator Representative Kitchens, is also here. That's a terrific piece of legislation. When the Clean Water Act was, when the Clean Water Act was passed, there was a great deal of investment made with our municipalities and most industrial point sources to try to make sure that they could continue functioning and meet the standards of the Clean Water Act. Now we're more than 30 years on, and everyone's expecting ag to get with it. But there's no new pool of cash to help us get with it. What this bill does is it actually creates a nutrient trading system and clearinghouse to ease the process of nutrient trading to allow us to use actually private sector funds in many cases to help farmers implement new water quality practices on their farms. This bill passed committee unanimously. It also passed the state Senate unanimously. There aren't a whole ton of bills that pass unanimously, so it must speak to the kind of quality of legislation it is. It's still waiting for a vote in the Assembly, but we would urge all of you to support it in its current form. Next, I want to talk briefly about 2 administrative rules that are in different stages of the process right now, but they're important to our water quality discussion and they're important to the future of dairy in our state. The first one is ACT 51. That's the livestock facility siting rule. That rule is currently, a draft of it is available. It's out for public hearing. In fact, one of the public hearings on that is occurring in Unalaska today. And its final public hearing on that draft rule will occur tomorrow in Spooner. We do have a couple of concerns about that rule in the current draft of that rule. One being that it changes the way the VTAs would be treated. And you know, I already asked you to be champions for VTAs. This rule is trying to keep you from being a champion for a VTA. So I'm hoping that what we can do is allow farmers who already have VTAs to continue using that practice regardless of the changes made to that rule. There are some exemptions made in the rule, but they're not as broad as what I just suggested. And I do think what I just suggested, because of what we've already discussed about VTAs, makes a lot of sense. We also have some concerns about setbacks for new farms. And just to be clear, livestock siting does not just regulate CAFOs. In fact, most farms regulated under livestock siting are non-CAFOs. It regulates down to 500 animal units, so about 300 dairy cows assuming they raise their young stock on the farm as well, maybe even fewer. So if you're covered by this rule, you're going to face these new setbacks. Again, mostly not geared at for water quality, actually geared in this case for odor control. But our fear is the same thing that I've already expressed to you, that many times what we're going to end up with is situations where people cannot meet those setbacks. What they're going to do when they want to expand instead is they're going to have to grow even larger because they're going to have to acquire new land to meet the setback, or to build a new manure pit and abandon their old manure pit. We have done some testing on these setbacks to see how they might work in the field. And one farm that recently went through the permitting process through livestock siting in Walworth County, there'd be no place for them, there'd be no way for them to keep their existing manure pit. It just would never meet the setback requirement. They'd have to build a new one, which they could probably do, but they'd have to take existing arable land out of production. They'd have to borrow again for that. And here you have a family farm that's trying to grow from about 200 cows to 400 cows in an effort to cash flow better. 30-year-old farmers with young kids, basically the exact kind of farmer we'd like to keep and have in Wisconsin for sure. And have their kids hopefully keep their farm and have it going forward. And what they might be forced into doing instead is they're going to have to borrow more, build more, grow more. And that's all fine if that's what they want to do. But when that setback really doesn't do anything for water quality and actually might encourage people to make decisions they don't want to make and decisions that maybe aren't in the best interest of the state, their neighbors, the dairy economy, why should we force them into that box? So we're looking for more flexibility on the setbacks. Next, we heard about a proposal from the governor and Secretary-designate Cole about opening up two other rules in our 151 and in our 243 to create a new targeted nitrate standard. This rule, the draft scope statement is available, and I believe it's probably heading to the Natural Resources Board later this month, where they'll vote on it. We do have some concerns about this as well, and I think some of those probably echo some of the comments that you heard from the Dairy Alliance. In our 151 and in our 243, don't reach that many farms. Again, maybe we're reaching 25% of livestock operations, a pretty small percentage of our total farmland. That is not the way to tackle the nitrate problem. We have nitrate concerns. I'm not sure I know what the absolute solution to them is. I doubt anyone on the committee knows, but some of you have some good ideas. And some of you are working really hard towards coming up with better ideas. And that's laudable. But what I do know is if you try to fix this problem by applying new standards to just a small subset of the overall farming operations in the state and not taking anything else into consideration, we're going to spend a lot of time and a lot of money implementing something that's going to disappoint us all at the end of the day. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at what they're suggesting, but that has to happen as part of a much broader discussion. And unfortunately, that broader discussion is not happening. And so those things need to be brought together. And now, a few words about CAFOs. But I'll keep this really short because you've already heard a bunch about CAFOs. But I love CAFOs. And so I've showed you a picture of a nice, pretty CAFO. And I don't have any problem with smaller farms either. But what I'm hoping is that people will question their assumptions about large farms. The farm we run today is a family-run operation that just happens to be a CAFO. My board members who happen to own CAFOs, they're all family operations who just have grown over time, maybe included more family members, and eventually reached that threshold of about 700 cows and had to become a CAFO. Now, we need to make sure that all farms are performing as they should, regardless of size. CAFOs, I think, actually are a big part of the solution. We're able to regulate them in a more uniform fashion. They're already doing a lot of things that we're not seeing elsewhere. They're able to afford some of the innovative approaches that I've already suggested, so they can be a big part of what can help us out of this. They're not just a problem. This does not mean that we shouldn't think about how we can improve the CAFO program. I think the CAFO program is something that is crying out for improvements. We've suggested several different solutions, including potentially revamping the program entirely and moving it from one jurisdiction of one state agency to another. Now that's a controversial idea, and I understand that. But our idea behind it wasn't just to move jurisdictions and maybe get better regulators out of it. It really was because we thought we needed to rethink the program from the ground up. There probably is some of that that's necessary, but that has to happen again with farmers at the table, with the environmental community at the table, and with all of you at the table to make sure we end up with something that's workable for everybody. And with that, I'll take any questions that you might have.
Thanks, John. A couple things. I was glad to see you talk about the importance of soil depth mapping and groundwater testing. As you're aware, one of the reasons that this committee formed, Representative Tranel and I asked for it after the SWIG study, water testing in Grand Island, Lafayette. Kind of on that note, I just would like to know that the SWIG study, Lafayette County couldn't afford to pay their portion. The farmers, many that you know, actually stepped up and paid for part of the study because when we started this process, we were approached by almost every farm group, and they said, hey, we're a piece of this puzzle, we want to be part of the solution. So I just think that that is an important thing that everybody stepped forward today and all the way along. The SWIG study, those farmers did not, in today's economy, did not have to pony up thousands of dollars to test the county. But I think what I'm getting to is, I think it's important that we map these, we water test these counties as we're moving along. We've heard several counties that say, hey, we want to do county water testing, but I don't, how much is it, 150,000 to do a county? It depends on the county, so it's very expensive. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to point that out. I was glad to see you point out that the water, we need to do county water testing. So,
thank you.
I was going to say similar. Can you hear me at all? There it is.
I can.
Okay, this one's a little more sensitive.
But I'm closer than they are.
So. Okay, so thanks so much. I want to start with NR 151, the targeted performance standards. I was going to ask you what concerns you had, because that's the first that I've heard of it. If your only concern, it sounds like, is that it doesn't reach that many farms. If the new, it's just a scope statement, so we don't know what it's going to look like, but let's play this out. Let's say hypothetically it did include more. Would you be supportive of it then? Would you be less concerned?
Well, that would help, but unfortunately we can't do that with those rules. So the scope statement alone could not do it. In fact, it would probably require a legislative effort independent of that rulemaking process. So I think that would be my response to that.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say we did that, and let's say we said, we heard today that some of the larger farms are concerned that the medium-sized farms aren't following nutrient management plans, the small ones don't have them, or if they do, they're shelved, or someone else is writing them. So let's say, just hypothetically, and this is something we've been hearing at task force hearings, let's say every single farm in Wisconsin follows a nutrient management plan, and let's say that nutrient management plan is free to them, and let's say the farmer helped write it, and let's say the plan is based on the soil type, what they're growing, and a lot more regional with input from like a local county conservationist or an ag agent. What would you say to something like that?
I think that's a really important first step. And that may not be enough either, and it might depend on the region. Again, one of the challenges we have, the targeted performance standards are allowed by existing law in areas where we've seen substantial compliance with existing standards, but we still have ongoing water concerns. One of my bigger concerns about the nitrate proposal is that we may not be able to meet either of those thresholds. What happened in the eastern part of the state when we had those target performance standards that have already been enacted is we had a lot of data out of northeastern Wisconsin about silurian dolomite, and we also had very broad adoption of existing standards. For example, in Kewaunee County, adoption levels of NR 151 are over 90%. So we could actually point to both those things. A, we've got a place where most everyone's following the rules, and B, we still have some concerns about water, even though most people are following the rules. That is unfortunately not the case for very many parts of the state. Either we don't have the data to show the scope of the problem we have, or we have very low compliance with existing standards because, again, for the reasons I pointed out, they're really not mandatory.
Right, and I think, that's a good example because when we were in Green Bay, we heard from a lot of folks from Kiwanee County who said, we're telling everyone, it's 2 feet to bedrock, that's the minimum, but we want to go way above that, right? So what if, at the county level, they say, okay, well, here's part of your midterm management plan, this is where you can spread, this is where you can't, we've got all the counties mapping it. I think that's kind of what we're looking at, is adding on those extra steps based on the region of the state and the different sensitivities that are there, right? So I appreciate that point. You also mentioned that NR 151 isn't adequately funded. I appreciate you pointing that out because I think we heard from Land and Water in the first hearing that the last estimate that was made was maybe almost a decade ago now for how much it would cost to fund. So without indexing to inflation, I believe it was $58 million more. Do you said in the last budget cycle, someone had requested it. Do you know what that budget request would look like? If we were to put boots on the ground for enforcement and education related to NR 151.
So I don't know the number off the top of my head, and thanks for bringing up the indexing, because I think that's an important point, but it just makes my depressing point even more depressing, which is we haven't been adequately funding it, and we probably haven't done the math right to show how badly we haven't been adequately funding it.
Well, and that's something that I would like to do as part of the task force, is figure out what that means, because as we're talking about targeted performance standards and opening up this new scope statement for NR 151, I think anytime you say, hey, counties, hey, folks on the ground, do more, you've got to give them some more resources to do it, right? So, and we're hearing from people who are saying, hey, this is a good thing for us, we want this opened up, we want to be at the table, and from the central stands to southwest Wisconsin, they're saying, we're interested in looking at nitrate contamination and a more targeted rule, but there better be resources. So something we've got to look at.
And if I could add, Representative Shanklin, I would say that I would also encourage you guys to be creative about how you allocate those additional funds if you're able to allocate them. Right now, just sort of this one-size-fits-all, all counties get divvied up, good luck approach that we have, it doesn't make any sense that we do it that way. And the fact that I'm not just talking about raising the number up so we get to some magical number and still doing the same, be frank, dumb process that we currently do. We should have a competitive grant program for additional funds. So the counties that have the most need could get those funds first. And so that we actually can maybe judge who's doing the most with the additional money. A lot of these people, if they get cost share, they have a good farmer who wants to build a new manure pit. They're going to give them cost share for that. And I guess that's great because that's what it's for. But really we need to be trying to go after places that have problems and farmers who are having problems and giving them cost share, frankly, whether they want it or not, to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing on the landscape.
Thank you. One final question. So on your second to last slide, you said, we know this is a controversial idea, but you mentioned it anyway, so I want to dig in on that. Moving CAFO oversight from DNR to DACAP, why would that be a good thing? Like, knowing that there needs to be more resources for enforcement, I mentioned about 1 in 4 permits right now are expired due to the backlog. Why would we move this to DACAP?
So I just probably have a handful of different reasons. One, different state agencies have an easier time getting appropriation money through the state legislature right now. And there are a few agencies that have a hard time getting money through the appropriations process. So moving into one that might get more money might actually get you those more positions that you're looking for. And that's politics and all kinds of things that I'll leave to you guys. But I think you know what I speak of is not untrue. In addition, there are ways that we could save by moving it to DACAP because there's efficiencies already built in. So they have engineering staff at DACAP already because they already administer the non-point program through ACCAP 50 and they already administer livestock siting through ACCAP 51. So there's ways that we could build in efficiencies, I think, by moving it. Although I would say even if you choose that that's a bridge too far, that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about what would it look like if we could actually build our CAFO program from the ground up. When the Clean Water Act passed and it required people to get CAFO permits if you reached a certain animal unit threshold, as we got farms that grew to that size, we just kind of went with it. And as we got more farms that were that size, we kept adding staff and doing the best we could. We never had the opportunity to sit back and say, if we what do we really think, what's the maximum number of CAFOs that are likely in the state? What would it look like to build a program out about permitting those in an effective manner, dealing with compliance in an effective manner? Instead, we just sort of cobbled things together, and that was through no fault of our own. But from our perspective, one of the hopes of moving the program was to allow ourselves to have that conversation of what is the right-sized CAFO program look like for our state?
I appreciate you suggesting that, but I also want to point out that that failed. And so if your argument is to move something from one agency to another because you can get more money, because it's likely that DNR funding will fail, well, your proposal failed too, right? So I would say it's politics that it failed, and perhaps that's because it's not a good idea, but I appreciate you suggesting otherwise, just so that I have a good idea of where it came from. I also want to point out, though, that CAFOs don't actually, the permit fee doesn't fund the cost of oversight at all, right? It's what, $345? Sorry, $395, right?
I think you're right with 340.
Yeah, okay. So it's under $400. How much do you think it costs for a year of oversight? I mean, the difference compared to other people who have whipped these permits is significant. And so I think that's kind of what other people have pointed out is like, why don't you have them pay for their oversight like every other person under the whip these permit already does, right?
So you're correct that the fees are less than many of the other people who get NDPS or WPDS permits through the state. But very few of those permits actually cover all costs associated with the permit. In fact, almost none of them do. Partially because we kind of understand that there's a need to have certain industries, or we want to make sure we have wastewater treatment facilities. All those things help society function. And farmers are a big part of that. I think it's great that when we thank veterans for giving us freedom. And sometimes it's really great when we thank farmers for giving us freedom. And sometimes you get a farmer who is a veteran and he's like a unicorn because he gets to be both. Because the freedom for me to drive up here and for me to do everything that I do in my life exists because Representative Tranel is farming. And so, we're in a place of higher learning where people are going all kinds of degrees, but they're not going to become farmers, or not very many of them. And they're able to do all that, again, and they have the freedom to do that because we have farmers. So there is probably going to be some sort of societal subsidy for agriculture. And that makes sense to me, in other words. I think it's unrealistic to expect that. And we do the same, again, with all the other people who are getting permits, maybe not at the same level. One other consideration with that is where we fit with our neighboring states. It would be important for us, you heard from the WEA folks, that South Dakota is growing rapidly. They're maybe courting our farmers, courting our processors. They're not the only state that's doing that. We want to make sure that we stay competitively priced vis-a-vis those other states for that reason as well. Now, maybe 345's not the right number, but we could try and find that number, and whatever number that is, especially if we're trying to keep in mind being competitive, we're probably not going to get anywhere near covering cost, but we might do a better job. And one thing that did happen at least was that all the fee that's being collected now goes to the program, which historically it did not.
I appreciate that. I'll be very brief. Sorry, Mr. Chair. I was going to mention that 100% of the cost, but out of the CAFO oversight, 455 were funded. And so, you said maybe 345 isn't the right number. I would ask you to consider what is. Could we work together to talk about that? Because I do think if you look at the percentage of subsidy compared to all the other WIPDs, permittees, and I mentioned wastewater, for example, where you're paying by the amount of pollution, like that's a consideration to us. And I think parity or close to is something that we all should look at. If we've seen years of oversight problems, then obviously compliance is number one, right? Before you add on regulations, let's make sure compliance is funded with the right enforcement mechanism, whether it's staff or something else, right? Wouldn't that fee be a piece of that? And there are differing proposals in the budget. The governors didn't pass an alternative proposal. Senator Coles here? An alternative proposal from Senator Coles did, but only 4 of the 5 positions for oversight were funded. Maybe that's a place where we can work together to figure out what that appropriate fee looks like.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Kurtz.
Right, he's one of the unicorns. Thank you for pointing that out, Representative Tranel.
Wait, did you notice we all laughed when you said Representative Brown is a farmer, so I guess I can.
Yeah, you know, Representative Kurtz is the unicorn over there, isn't it? I will keep it really brief. I see a lot of eyes starting to get a little heavy. I want to get to the public, so I just want to be really quick on this. And I know it may not be a dairy issue more so than other farmers, but you mentioned something that really caught my attention, John, and I wanted to talk about it. Age of nitrates, right? I mean, so, especially where I am, we had the conversation, we got a certain operator towards the Lake Petenwell area, you know where I'm going. So age of nitrates in that area is a huge concern. If all application of nitrates stop there, the groundwater is not going to change its nitrate concentration for decades and decades and decades. You don't have the answer, I don't have the answer. When we start talking about keeping future nitrates out of that area for contaminant, are we getting to the point where we start requiring buffer zone for places that have high contamination of nitrates? Is that a bridge too far sometimes to talk about having to start requiring that in certain areas to stop future nitrates from getting into the groundwater?
So I think that's one possibility of things you could look at, Representative. I mean, the reality is, as you pointed out, we're talking about a generational problem that's going to require a generational solution. Multi-generational problem with a multi-generational solution. One more point for the dairy folks, I would say we do plant alfalfa to try and take some of that nitrates out. So if you'd like us to come to Lake Petenwell and plant some alfalfa, we'll try and help you out.
I take it. I mean, I'll take whatever I can get. I just want to make sure that as you ask us to champion, the VTAs and some of those other things you're asking us to champion, some on the committee and some in the legislature will say, well, we want to champion, but I think we're going to start having to require in certain places. I mean, and that's what we want to try to figure out, how to work through this problem programmatically. And you and I had a lot of conversations in the 13th session and 15th session about the sensitive resource area concept. Trying to regionalize requirements for certain areas of the state based on their problems and allowing regional decisions to be made. I don't know if we're getting closer to getting back to that conversation again, but wouldn't you say that, wouldn't you agree that we're really looking, we've got to do this regional-based, watershed-based, that's the whole benefit of the producer-led program that's worked so successfully. And wouldn't you agree that we've got to get away from this one-size-fits-all, and even when we revise that I-151 and 243 and AdCap 50, and we're doing all these things generically, statewide?
So I would agree 100% that we cannot try to solve the issues we face with a one-size-fits-all or a statewide solution. There might be certain things we could do that would be impactful everywhere, but most of these things are going to require us to dig in deeper and look regionally. And what that ends up looking like, it's a real question. But I do think when I started off by saying this is a partnership, DB at least means it, right? We're in it. So now that may not be that either of us end up happy, but that's part of the process.
Thanks.
Representative Brooks?
Thank you. Thank you, John. A couple points I want to raise. In your handout, you had talked about simplifying approvals for manure treatment, create a viable future for the digesters, rethinking how we classify food plot runoff, those kinds of things. And then you had also mentioned legislative efforts that we could do outside of the rulemaking process, because as you well know, once it gets into an agency and rulemaking starts, our hands are tied until we get those, and that ship has sailed. So I don't want to take your time today, but could your group put together a list of those items specifically, instead of just vague suggestions like simplify or create a more viable, could you detail those out? And are there things that we should have our committees look at as these rules are coming out of, the rule process, or should they be separate legislation that this committee should be?
So the PowerPoint I prepared for you today is based off of a handful of white papers. So that stuff exists already, and I'm happy to share it with you. White paper doesn't translate to PowerPoint, and I get yelled at if I have too much text on a slide by my coworkers, so I try to make them proud by making short statements. But yes.
Well, I appreciate that, and I bet you everybody out there appreciates the simplicity of it, but we need the details at some point. And one of the issues, I guess my last question is, when we talk about targeted standards, not just for farmers, because we've spent a lot of time today talking about farmers, but when we talk about the, pout systems or the wells, I get very concerned because when we talk about targeted standards and local control, which are very sensitive topics when it comes to politics, as you well know, one of the things that we have state standards for is to get rid of that whole NIMBY thing that happens, that whole not in my backyard, because if we left all of these decisions truly up to targeted local town boards, CAFOs would be pushed out at some point. There would be, we'd have lake associations saying, no, you can't bring your boat on my lake, we only want it for these people. So we have to kind of balance that. What is your, association alliance? How do we do the targeted standards? Do we do that at state level? Based on soil depths or mapping? In my mind, throughout this process, we've heard, number one, we need more boots on the ground at the county level, come up with that, and then another issue was better mapping, both for watersheds and soil, depths and everything else. Once we get those two knocked out of the way, how do we get to that targeted strategies while balancing that whole statewide standard without that NIMBY, fear factor?
Well, I really appreciate that question because it does, I can tell you that dairies are keenly aware of that problem, right? When a dairy goes to grow or expand, we often encounter that issue. So I don't think targeted performance standards necessarily translates to local control of those targeted standards. That doesn't mean you don't involve the locals in helping you get to what those targeted standards might be. But in many cases, we're talking about a town board with 3 guys who do it because they volunteer and God bless them for doing it, or 3 gals who do it. They don't have the resources or the expertise to come up with those targeted standards. It is incumbent on the agencies in the state to help them get there. So when we look at, for example, of 151, in our 151, we have targeted performance standards, but those were implemented at the state level, or implemented by the state for a particular region with state expertise. They weren't left up to those local governments. I think one concern that I think it's one we share is we don't want any new regulation to be used just as a weapon against development. We do actually have some realistic issues that we have to deal with, and we have some things we can do to try to help with those issues, but that doesn't need to devolve into some sort of like the NIMBYism that you talked about.
Right. And I guess I'm going back to that. I've seen in every single one of these that I've been able to attend a tremendous partnership between farmers and the county associations to partner together to come up with best practices based on their soil types, where they're at in the mapping process, because every area of the state is different as to where they're at in that process. Areas of southeastern Wisconsin are narrowed down to almost every square foot. Other areas of the state are way behind in those. So I think the targeted approach, while still maintaining some overall control and guidance by the state, is the correct thing, but I think we need to get the boots on the ground and have that data first before we start passing a bunch of statewide or even targeted strategies. Your thoughts on that specifically?
So I think there are probably it depends on probably the topic you're talking about. One of the challenges with the task that you've all taken on by serving on this committee is you're dealing with surface water, groundwater, all the issues related to both of those. So I think some of them we're at different stages in the game, basically, of looking at different issues that you guys are trying to tackle. In many instances, I think you're right. We'd be rushing to judgment to make some of those decisions now. On some of the other issues, maybe we're closer to being there.
Last question, Mr. Chairman. So, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I like your suggestion of competitive grants so that we're not divvying up whatever money we allocate and dividing it by 72 counties, that we could afford to play catch up in some of these other either regional areas or by county, or watershed, where the demand is the greatest. And I'm hoping your alliance could help us in determining that.
I think that'd be great. I'm not sure that what role we would play in helping to do that, but I think that's the smart move, and again, knowing that the resources are tight, it's the way to make the greatest impact with the smallest amount of money.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation, John. And I also would like to thank DBA, because when we opened up the new rules for NR 151 for Northeast Wisconsin, you guys were supportive of us opening it, along with other farm groups, and you endorsed the final product that came out of it, along with most of the conservation groups around the state also endorsed the final product. So I appreciate your involvement in that, because I don't think we're going to get where we want to get with water quality without buy-in from the farmers. And also, as you pointed out, in Kewaunee County in particular, we were able to demonstrate that the current rules with full implementation were not protecting our groundwater. And really legally, we're supposed to be able to show that in order to open it again. And I think that's a contrast to how the new nitrate scope statement came out, where we had been bipartisan before, it came out in a partisan way without consulting the farm group. So I hope we can take a step back from that and continue to have your involvement and all the other farm groups as we move towards doing that. Because nitrates are, as you also correctly pointed out, it's very complicated and it's not going to be simple to come up with those answers. I don't think anybody really knows at this point how we can do that. We certainly all want to get there. So.
Well, thank you for that, and I agree, and also thank you for the separate nitrate working group, which is sort of digging into that particular sub-issue in more detail, because I think we have a lot of work to do there still. So we appreciate your leadership on it.
Well, yeah, we have a lot. Anyway, thank you.